Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so glad so many of you could join us this evening, and I just want to encourage you as you finish your snacks and drinks, if you could come towards the center to the chairs, and you can still continue to grab things to eat. We've got plenty, and I think the wine just makes it a little better. So keep doing that, and maybe I didn't tell you my name. It's Deirdre Cross, Assistant Director of Public Programs here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I'm so pleased you joined us for another collaboration with the National Human Genome Research Institute. We've worked together highlighting the intersection of race, science, and history for over a decade. And it's been a wonderful partnership, and we've developed a lot of wonderful friendships over the years, and just so glad to see us take this direction. We have an exciting panel tonight with a group of emerging experts who are conducting groundbreaking research in genetics. We're pleased to have our panelists join us, especially as they build on the legacy of African American scientists featured upstairs in our galleries. To speak more about tonight's collaboration and to introduce our panelist is Mr. Vince Bonham, Acting Director for NHGRI and a wonderful friend of the museums. Please join me in welcoming Vince.
So good evening. I am so excited to be here this evening and have the opportunity to introduce our panel for today. But this is a special space that we're in, and I just am pleased to be here with this great art and in this great space to talk about the future of science and the role of African Americans in that future. So with that, I really come to this evening with that understanding that this is looking forward and where we as a people are going to be involved in all types of biomedical research and science. So again, I want to thank Deirdre Cross for introducing me this evening. As stated, I'm the Deputy Director at the National Human Genome Research Institute. The National Human Genome Research Institute is one of 27 institutes and centers that make up the National Institutes of Health. That is the biomedical research engine of our country. On behalf of our director, Dr. Eric Green, I want to express the appreciation to the museum for their continued partnership for the past decade. I particularly want to thank Leslie Walker and Deirdre Cross for their collegiality and their work with us over the years. We've worked together and done programs with the Henrietta Lacks family around issues of genetics and genomics. We've done issues with regards to understanding ancestry and identity in genetics. And we continue to work with the museum to bring information about genetics and genomics and biomedical research to the public. Today is the third program of a 4-part series. We had the opportunity to have conversations with some senior leaders, scientists, with regards to issues within the field of genetics and genomics. And we're looking forward to our next session that will be focused on the barriers and how do we break through the barriers to get more African Americans and individuals of color in biomedical research and science. I'm delighted to introduce our 3 panelists and our moderator who exemplify some of the best and the brightest of our next generation of African American researchers, geneticists, and scientists and clinicians. So let me start by welcoming you Dr. Chris Williams, who is a trained biologist who completed his doctorate at Georgetown University. He is the STEM education specialist at the museum and is responsible for helping audiences learn of the unknown and forgotten stories and contributions of African Americans in science, technology, engineering, and math. Our panelists are Dr. Tina Lasisi, who is a biological anthropologist and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California. And in the fall, she will be an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Michigan. Our second panelist is Dr. Carter Clinton. He's a biologist, a genetic anthropologist. He was formerly the assistant curator of the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory at Howard University, and he is currently a postdoctoral fellow in biology and anthropology department at Penn State. And finally, Mr. Jameson Floyd, who is a Morehouse School graduate with a degree in physics. He is currently in the intramural research program at the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health and is a future physician scientist. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Folks, you can join me up here as well. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Williams, and as Vince said, I'm the STEM education specialist here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And beside me, we have Tina Lasisi, we have Carter Clinton, and then we have Jameson Floyd. So I'm glad that you're all here. So let's get started. We're going to start with a simple question. So I want you all to briefly describe your research, but then also after you do that, please tell me how you got involved and interested in STEM and when you knew that a STEM career was right for you. We can start with you, Tina.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here tonight. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I do. I did my dissertation research on the genetics and evolution of human scalp hair morphology, but I also work on the evolution and genetics of skin pigmentation and pigmentation in general. And my story of how I got into STEM is actually a little bit funny. I was not one of those kids who was into science growing up. I really liked culture. I really liked history, actually. But then I got into anthropology. And I did my studies in England, and the way that they taught anthropology there, you got to learn cultural anthropology, archaeology, and biological anthropology. So going in, I thought, definitely gonna be a cultural anthropologist. I love languages, I love people, that's what I'm gonna do. But one lecture really changed that for me. We had a lecture on human variation that talked about how human skin pigmentation evolved. And I remember seeing this map of the distribution of UV radiation around the world and the distribution of skin color around the world. And I don't know if you've seen that, but those of you who have will note that there is a very clear pattern. The closer you were to the equator, the darker your skin was. The further you were from the equator, the less UV radiation there was, the lighter your skin was. And this was something that held across continents. And that was the first time in my life that I ever thought about it in that way, because I knew, oh, if you were from Africa, you have dark skin. If you're from Europe, you have light skin, but I didn't realize how much variation there was. And that little mystery that was like solved for me there really set me off and made me think, okay, what about hair? Now I know I'm brown, why is my hair curly? And it turned out that there wasn't really a ready answer. And so that kind of set me off on this journey to find some answers about that. And here I am now trying to still find those answers. And yeah, working on hair and skin together now.
Thank you. Carter?
Yeah. First, I'll say thank you again for having me here. Good evening, everyone. I will answer the question in the reverse, because the way that I got interested in science led me to the work that I'm doing now. So I was always interested in science, always interested in biology, the same thing that young scholars get excited about now, seeing things change colors, before your eyes, or having a hands-on experience in a lab, in a science class that you don't get in a history class, right? Those are the things that really got me excited. And I got to undergrad, and I thought, like many other students, oh, I'm good at science, or I like science and I want to help people. So I'm going to go to med school. And that really wasn't the path for me. The thing that flipped the switch was a class also that I took, cell and molecular biology, and I learned about genetic engineering. And this is when it was really at the forefront, learning that still wanting to be a doctor and having that health component in mind, but looking at the genetics and thinking, oh, I can change this one thing about a person and they could not have this disease. Like, is that possible? Is that an area that I want to, go into and explore. And so that really pulled me to the research side of medicine. And so through undergrad, that is kind of the direction that I was in, looking at DNA sequences and how can we change things for the better. And then I get to grad school and I meet Dr. Fatima Jackson, who offered me the opportunity to work with the New York African Burial Ground. Being an African American man from Brooklyn, I jumped at the opportunity. And so I wanted to look at these DNA sequences in this historic enslaved population. But then I realized, okay, when we go and look at the database, or if we go behind the scenes of the behind the scenes, it's just nothing there. The representation is just not represented. And so that has also been tied into the work. So the project that ties all of that together is I work with the New York African Burial Ground, which is the oldest and largest burial site of free and enslaved Africans ever discovered in the country. I hope to, or what we've been doing is learning everything that we can about who these people are, how they live, their lived experience, uncover these voices and how they died for genetic or infectious diseases. And moving now into my postdoc, looking at living African Americans. So how can we connect these 400 years of history? How can we connect these enslaved or African American populations to people who live today, and why is that important?
All right, thank you. Jameson?
Yeah. Well, hey y'all. Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. And just like Dr. Clinton, I also was a kid that loved science. My mother is a chemical engineer. My father studied chemistry in college. I have two sisters that are older than me that are both in science and healthcare. So for us, that was just kind of the language we spoke. That was like what was understood. That's what we did. And so what that looked like for me was actually going into engineering. So had you asked me when I was going into college and high school, what do you want to be when you grow up, I would have said an engineer. That's what was familiar to me. And it took doing a summer research program where I actually was doing a bit of clinical shadowing. That was the first time to really seen doctors and clinicians interact with patients so closely. And it was an interaction with an older black man, actually, that I still remember very clearly to this day, that I think kind of sparked this like pivot, I guess, from wanting to do engineering to maybe want to be a physician, because I felt like there was some element of that interaction that was severely lacking, and it felt very tied to the fact that this was a black man in this clinic with a non-black physician. And so I just kind of kept pulling at that thread further into my college years, which is kind of how I ended up in the NHGRI and as a postbac fellow, where now I study the way race is kind of used in medicine and genetics and genomics specifically. So I'm a part of Mr. Bonham's lab at the NHGRI. We're the Health Disparities Unit. And it's just been a huge kind of affirming couple of years for me that, this path and this question that I've seen come to light in my life really is a valuable one, and one I think, I want to keep asking and keep working towards. So that's kind of how I got to where I am.
Thank you for those answers. It seems like a lot of scientists have that spark or get that interest very early in life. I remember I got my interest when I was raising guppies and tadpoles, and that's how it started for me. So Jameson, I want to follow up with you. So you just mentioned you wanted to do engineering, but you ended up going to Morehouse where you got your bachelor's in physics, but now you're at NHGRI, and then you have plans to go to med school. Can you tell me about the process of moving from one field to the next, and how has that transition been for you?
Oh, certainly. And when you say it like that, it sounds much cooler than how it actually is felt. I think for me, I've always just thought about making the next right move, which is just how it kind of becomes this twisty-turvy, windy road, at least what it feels like at times. So, yeah, I started out in freshman year up until I was really halfway through my junior year thinking I was going to go to get a PhD in biomedical engineering. But again, like I said, I had that experience that summer where I started to change my mind, and that required a lot of introspection and saying is this a fleeting interest? Is this a cool thing I did? Mm-hmm. Or is this really worth taking a lot of extra steps. I mean, at this point, I hadn't taken all those pre-med classes, or organic chemistries, biochemistries. I hadn't done any of that. I was deep into like quantum physics and special relativity, stuff I don't even use anymore. So it was a really introspective process. Talked to a lot of my mentors and advisors, which I think, I'll highlight some of those people in those conversations, because that I think was a difference maker for me, especially at a place like Morehouse. I think like the ethos of the institution really does support the young men and students that are there and trying to achieve whatever they set out to do. And so I think the process really was a lot of just making the next right move, being determined and intentional, and taking this class or taking this MCAT prep course, or talking to this person to see like, is this the right next move? So it's kind of the way I try to go about it.
Okay. So I'm going to follow up with another. So how difficult was the transition? Were you nervous about your ability to switch?
Oh, yeah.
And also I want to ask you two, both Tina and Carter, have you had any transition switching fields, maybe from undergrad to graduate school to where you are now?
Yeah, as quickly as go. I certainly felt nervous. I think imposter syndrome is a real thing. You ask yourself, am I even capable of doing this? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing? But that's when discipline and kind of that support and village that you try to build and have comes to really like shine and help you just push through those moments of doubt or insecurity. So.
All right, thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned mentorship. We'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that one later. Now, Carter and Tina, you're both anthropologists. Carter, you are a genetic anthropologist, and Tina, you are a biological anthropologist. Now, upstairs on our third floor in our community galleries, we have a display that talks about, it features William Montague Cobb, who was the first African-American anthropologist to earn his doctorate. On top of that, he was also a physician and also a civil rights leader. He served as the NAACP president for 6 years, and also he was an editor for the National Medical Association, which is the African-American version of the American Medical Association. Now, to both of you, as anthropologists, how do you see yourself in your research following along in his legacy?
Do you want to go first?
I can do that. So first, it has been difficult for me somewhat because by definition, I'm not an anthropologist, so all of my degrees are in biology. And it's even the big elephant in the room, or the first question that I get when I go on job interviews in an anthro department, because I'm not classically trained. However, I was the assistant curator of the Cobb Research Lab. I, was trained under Dr. Fatima Jackson, who is a biological anthropologist, and I went to Howard, who didn't have an anthropology department. So even if I wanted to get a degree in anthropology and call it that, I couldn't. But I think the work that I do is the happy marriage that is the title of biological anthropology, right? All my degrees are in biology, but I ask these anthropologically directed questions, so that's what I am, right? I mean, I hate to go back to why I put a label on things, but this is the type of work that I do. It was Dr. Jackson who taught me, okay, you can be interested in genetic engineering. You can be interested in, DNA analysis and next generation sequencing, but what does that DNA sequence mean for the person that it came from? Or how is the engineering of that DNA sequence going to benefit the entire community from the findings of whatever that research is? And I think that's what anthropology is, and I think that it's very layered, right? I get that from her, but also the legacy of Cobb, who was asking these questions well before, anybody else was asking these questions, as a true Renaissance man and paving and a trailblazer, right? And I think that's one thing that I've incorporated into my work. There is no lane, right? So I have to create this lane to do the work that I want to do, to make it purposeful, and to make it benefit the people that I care about.
Thank you.
So it's actually interesting because I feel, talking to Carter it makes so much sense that you were in the Cobb lab, and me following that legacy feels weird as someone who came to the US for grad school, and I am part of the African diaspora, but I've been adopted in by African Americans. And so my history with anthropology is different, but it does start with anthropology, and especially these broad classical anthropology questions of like, what does it mean to be human? What are all the different ways that you can be human? And making the transition actually to do something more genetic and more biological, that's been my journey, which feels a little bit more difficult, but I feel like we end up converging in the same place, because I started really from wanting to understand what the story was. Because what the nice thing is about evolutionary anthropology is that you can see it as big evolutionary history. It's big human history. Like, what is the story of this group of people? Like, what is their history? How are they related to each other? What is the story of a trait? Why does tightly coiled hair exist? No other mammal has it. We don't have an answer for it. And coming in and seeing what all the tools are that we can use to answer those questions has really been something that's become really interesting, because that's also the part of science that shows you it's not just science. Like, the people who do the science really matter, because what their observations are is going to be shaped by their lived experiences. And so in that sense, like, I feel like where I ended up puts me in this space where I get to bring people into that and show that it's not just like this history of people who've done particular things. It's all of us who can come from different backgrounds and ask these questions about what it means to be human in the way that we are, which oftentimes isn't really focused on.
Thank you for mentioning that, because it leads right into my next question. So what motivates your research questions? And like, when you're asking a question or doing anything in the lab, who are you thinking about, who you want it to impact?
Well, I can start. I think about the either descendant community or local community first, whoever the population is under study. Because so many times in science, we're so tunnel visioned to think whatever we're doing in the lab or in the hood, that is what matters. We need to get this publication out. But it's so much more than just doing the science and writing an article, because Uncle Joe down the street is not going to pick up a human genetics journal article and be like, oh, this is how I can help my diabetes, right? So it's about doing the work, but also meeting people where they are and speaking in a language that they understand, that they can benefit from. And that has actually been the thing that has sparked my passion for science communication. So after the first National Geographic video came out, I got young scholars who looked like me who said, hey, I didn't even know you could do this. I didn't even know this was a thing. But it went beyond that to people who were reaching out to me like, oh, I have this. How do I do that? How can I access information? Because everything is gatekept. And so, again, the person who it is supposed to benefit, and we even spoke about helicopter research, right? Just going into communities just so you can look at whatever it is that you're interested in, write the paper and move on without any benefit to the community is something that we need to change in the field. Those things I'm 100% passionate about, and those are the priorities when I establish a new research project.
Okay.
I think being at the NIH and NHGRI, one of the, privileges of being in these institutions is you have touch points with policymakers and corporations. So I think, in our group, in our lab, I think one of the things that we try to do is through telling the stories of this community of individuals living with sickle cell disease, that is one disease that's been so well characterized for over 100 years, but yet is lagging in research funding. There's stigma and discrimination in a clinical setting against people that present with sickle cell disease. So we're hoping, I think, among many things, that we can bring this story and bring this perspective from the lived experience of these people to policymakers and people at these huge genetic companies or what have you, other institutes at the NIH even, to just shine a light on things that without us asking these questions, without researchers, a diverse kind of of background, you won't get this perspective. So I think that's one of the target groups that I think is really important. We're trying to get them to listen, get them to see what it is that we are curious about.
Yeah. And I have to say, I feel like the angle that I have on my research and who it benefits and how it benefits them is one that gets to be, I don't even know how to say it, but have less of the weight of responsibility of helping people's health immediately. I feel like that's something that's put on us and that's put on the African diaspora as well. What is the research that we can do? It has to be research, on health that's going to help our people immediately, and that's this huge weight on our shoulders. It's very important, but it also means that there isn't always as much research being done and as many people having the opportunity to ask questions that are less immediately applicable, like where do we come from? Why do we look this way? There might not be an immediate application, but you never know where that can go. And the example that I always give is melanin. I remember being on the early internet, and I promise you, nobody was talking about melanin. That was not a word that people were using. But now I'll scroll through Instagram and it's hashtag melanin, and it's melanin merch. And I love that. That makes me so happy. Just the stuff that our people do with it, it's just so joyful. It's you are literally photosynthesizing. You are taking sunlight. You're doing stuff with it. The way that people then conceptualize themselves, right? They see this pigment and how it makes them special, something that's been demonized, and they see its biological value. They see how magical it is. And no one can take that away from you. Science is on your side. And that is not something that people discovered immediately thinking, okay, how are we gonna apply this with health benefits, even though that knowledge does end up having applications that we can use in medicine. And I wanna do the same with hair, because I want, kids in the future to be able to say hey, you can say whatever you want about my hair, but our ancestors evolved this. Our ancestors are the only mammals who evolved this. And this is something that quintessentially makes us human. And for me, that pride that comes from knowing your history and knowing your history, big picture, that's why I do it. And everyone who benefits from that, that's who I do it for.
Thank you. I love those answers, and what I'm hearing is that whether the research is basic or whether it is applied, what I'm learning just from talking to you all is that all of your research leads to an opportunity for self-discovery. So that's really powerful. So I'm going to leads to this next question. So I Googled scientists today. I just wanted to see what popped up. It wasn't you all. It was generally older white men, lab coats, people doing fake science experiments, pouring colored solutions from one beaker to the next. But tell me why it's important that you all show up as you are when you go to a lab, whether you're in conferences or whether you're on camera.
Well, I can go first. I think a lot of younger people, especially that I meet, older people are surprised when they hear what I do and the fact that, not trying to flex, but that has been recognized, that people respect that. There's a shock, and then in a lot of young people especially, there's this moment of shock and also oh, that means that could be me. And I really think that that's important because you need to not perceive barriers. There's this sort of meme on Instagram that I come across a lot that says, be delusional. And in some sense, yes, do not see limitations, because being able to dream what you want to do, being able to walk around with the entitlement of, I think I have a great scientific question, is really powerful. And seeing someone exemplify that is a gift that you can give to someone that hopefully builds that confidence within them because they've seen it modeled. And then also secondarily, as somebody who didn't start in STEM, I always really hope to inspire people that scientific questions are for everyone and they can be contributed by everyone. And making it understandable, a lot of us do in our science communication, I think that's a big part of it.
I agree.
I think it kind of as it pertains to representation in science. Like I kind of said in my talking about my upbringing, for me, scientists were black people. It was my mom, it was my sisters. So I think in a way, I guess as a privilege and a benefit, but even thinking more broadly, just outside of my own experience, I think representation matters, but I think we need to talk about like why specifically does that change things? Does it move things in a better direction? And there's so much data out there that shows that when you have people from different backgrounds, different life experiences, whether that's race, where you're from, geographically, what have you, what language you speak, like the science is better. The science it's richer. The findings are more generalizable. So when we talk about people that look like us, being the face of science, so to speak, that is the ultimate goal we're striving for. Not just to have more Black people in spaces and not really moving the needle. No, it's to make sure that the end product that we're delivering that is going to eventually reach people's lives in whatever way, shape, or form that is something that's better than what we started off with. So,
Thank you. So last week we had a program with NASA, and we had invited some school groups from Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. And one of the students was walking in, and he walked past this big poster with NASA astronauts on it, and he turned around and looked, and he said, "He looks like me." And the tears started coming to my eyes. I was like, this is exactly why I do what I do. And the same thing for you as well. So you just mentioned why it's important to diversify the field of genetics. So what are you all doing to make sure you're getting out there, let people see you and know that you exist beyond this?
I'm on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter.
Yeah, I think for me, it's talking to the communities and putting people first so they can direct the science, not going out into the community with already developed objectives and questions. But Jameson, to really compare to the first point that you made, I didn't have those examples growing up. I didn't have examples of what a PhD would look like, or even MDs until you go to the doctor. But in the community, we didn't have that. I did have teachers who cared about my success as a student and as a person, and we had school plays like Black Panther, right? Mm-hmm. So I had some pride in myself. And we're all first generation. My sister actually inspired me to go on and get a PhD. Although I graduated before she did. So I'm the first in our family to do that. She's mad. But it means showing up in spaces as my unapologetically authentic self. So one thing that my advisor told me is that you should always show up as yourself, because people decide whether they like you or not before you walk through the door. Mm-hmm. So like even being a guy with hair, right? Like through the pandemic, my hair was like pretty long because I couldn't get to a barbershop because they weren't open. And people had a problem with that because the gatekeepers are usually white men who see hair, especially for a guy, as unkempt, inappropriate for the workplace. But when I did that National Geographic video with braids, and it was like Explore Classroom, something like that, whatever the case was, I got the most feedback from that video. So I think it's important to be yourself. It's important to let the next generation know that they can be themselves, right? Your hair is beautiful. Wear the Jordans, do the thing that makes you feel comfortable.
I like it. So this is the time now for the audience. If you have any questions, please write them down, and someone from our staff will come and collect them and bring them up to the stage. So take a couple minutes, start to think of any questions, write them down, and then I'll have an opportunity to read them. So Carter, I wanted to go back to you. So I know you do research where you look at the health of enslaved Africans from the burial grounds, and you get to do very cool techniques to collect your samples. Can you tell us about how you collect your samples, and then how the data that you gather actually impacts the health and identity of us today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the easy thing for me was working with the New York African Burial Ground, because the remains were already collected after the 1991 excavation. So they were already on loan from the National Park Service at Howard University, and that's when I came along and kind of stepped into that project. My contribution there was the remains that we had were only burial soil. So out of respect for African Americans in New York, because this was their request, After the anatomical analyses and osteological analyses, they reburied the bones. So I didn't have any bones. I didn't have any human bones to analyze. All I had was the soil. And so my initial question is, can we identify the human existence from burial soil? And at the time, it was very difficult to make that happen because it was novel, hadn't been done. So it was hard to find funding. Even funders didn't see the value in the project and said, this is dirt. It's 400-year-old dirt. You'll never see anything. And so that forced me to be resilient, take a roundabout way and say, okay, we're not going to look at human DNA right away. Let's look at bacterial DNA, the things that we know are in soil. It's either going to look like environmental soil or it's going to look like the human microbiome that was there. And so we went ahead, we did that. We saw the human microbiome, which proves our 400-year-old existence in burial soil and is now our proof of concept to look for human DNA. And so with that human DNA, now we can compare that to people who are living today for means of ancestry, identity, and health, for how our what genetic diseases do we see 400 years ago? What does that look like today due to certain selective pressures, right? Like slavery or Jim Crow racism. Or because we were looking at the bacteria, we can also look at infectious diseases. So what do these species or these strains look like 400 years ago, and what do they look like in the CDC database today? And if we can compare the two, how do we create these models to combat those things in the future? So probably went off on a tangent on that one.
It was. I'm glad you talked about how you collected the
is
samples
all-
from the soil. That's what I really wanted.
Yeah.
So the next one is Tina. We know you study hair, the human scalp, the hair morphology, and texture. Now, the human genome has about 20 to 25,000 genes in it. Can you share with us how many genes actually impact hair texture, hair color, all of those things?
Ooh.
And when people find out that it's so few, what do they say?
Didn't expect this to be my defense quiz all over again. Just kidding.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So what's actually really interesting about that is it would be difficult to answer that question for any trait in any population, but when it comes to our hair, it's understudied, and I'll explain why. So in order to understand what genes are associated with whatever traits, one thing that you can do is look at how genetic variation correlates with variation in a trait. However, if you can't measure variation in a trait, then you can't link it to variation in the genes. And as many of you will know, the way that we usually talk about hair, it's a lot of people, broadly hair is spoken about is, straight, wavy, curly, maybe kinky if we're feeling spicy and diverse. Then there's obviously other scales like the Walker scale, 3A, 3B, all of that good stuff that especially Black women have really pioneered and developed during the natural hair movement. But that level of resolution isn't used in a lot of the genetic studies that have been done on hair. They really just use those earlier descriptive terms that I talked about, straight, wavy, curly. And a lot of the research was done on European and some Asian populations. And I remember for my dissertation, I was looking and I was like, there's no way I'm the only person, I'm not the only person who's thought about this. There's gotta be somebody who's done this. And the closest I came to finding this was a study, a genetic association that was done in a group of Latin Americans that had mixed ancestry, so also African ancestry. And I was like, boom, finally, we're gonna figure out what contributes to our coils. But the way that they talked about the different traits was straight, wavy, curly, and kinky. And the worst part is that they didn't even have a lot of Afro-descended people in their sample somehow. And they said that only 2% of their sample had kinky hair, and so they excluded them from the analysis. Right? I know, that's how I felt. So I was like, you're so close. You could have just called me. But that means that what we do know about genes that are associated with hair, it's definitely missing a lot of pieces. So what I was able to do in my dissertation was I developed new methods for carefully measuring objectively hair curvature. And so that goes, one step beyond something like the Walker system, because that's still subjective. Like, who gets to decide who's like a 3C and who's like a 4A? But if we measure how tightly your hair is coiled, that's like, we can all agree on that. And so I did a genetic association with a group of people who had African and European ancestry, so anywhere from 10% to 100% African ancestry. And long story short, what I was able to show is that there are a lot of genes that have previously been associated with hair, with hair morphology in non-African populations that do play some role in the variation we see in this group. But there's certainly going to be variants that we don't know of. And that's something that we learned with skin color, because a few years ago, 2017 was a good year, 2018, there were a lot of papers that came out about the genetics of skin color, and the genetics of skin color specifically across the African continent. And a lot of early genetic studies were talking about how this one gene in particular called MC1R wasn't very variable in Africans, and it's probably because they're all the same and they all have this pressure to be dark, yada, yada, yada. Look, we have red hair and blonde hair in Europe. It must be much more diverse. But then we found all these other genes that we didn't realize played a role in human skin pigmentation that were variable in Africans. And so that's kind of like what I am trying to do for hair as well. Like, really get us to have the samples that we need, have the methods that we need.
Okay, and I apologize if I brought up any tough memories from your defense.
It's okay, it's been 2 years, I'm over it.
Okay, good. All right, so our first question from the audience is, and this is directly related to all the things that you mentioned. So first off, you all are very inspiring. Like, I'm older than you and very inspired, So, but I know you didn't get here just through a straight path. It's been challenges. So can you talk about some of the setbacks and challenges you faced to get to where you are right now?
I guess I can start. I think mine's probably gonna pale in comparison to going through a whole PhD at this point, but I think for me, yeah, it was definitely a challenge switching my major and deciding to take time after undergrad. When I saw a lot of my friends that were trying to be doctors going straight to medical school, you can definitely get in the comparison game very, very easily. And COVID doesn't help when you're trying to do all these things, take your classes, take your MCAT, get research experience under your belt, and you have to do it all from your computer. So I think for me, that was something that I had to just roll the punches on. I think fortunately it's working out, and I'm really grateful for where I am now. But it'd be a lie to say it wasn't different than what I expected. So.
Yeah, I probably listed a lot of the challenges as a result of answering the other questions. So I think one, not having that representation. You can't be what you can't see. And I think that's what we need to be for I know we keep saying it, but it does take work, right? Just being visible makes a world of a difference to young students. As far as the research, just trying to get it funded to get someone to see value in this enslaved population that, one, people believed, oh, the New York African Burial Ground, that was from the 90s, that project is closed, right? It's done. They took the measurements, they looked at the teeth, they did, isotope analysis, that's past, right? But that's why science advances and techniques become anew so that you can go back and either clarify or confirm or ask new questions, right? In the 90s, we didn't have the DNA technology that we have now. And so it was the perfect opportunity to say, okay, I have this very strong foundation for a project. Why not go back and learn more and clarify this story, right? Turn up the resolution on who this population was. And I could not, for the life of me, get a funder to, like, an NSF grant to fund the entire dissertation. And so I had to go out and fund smaller parts of the project and say, okay, well, instead of, paying my salary as a grad student, whatever, $30,000, okay, can I have $5,000 so I can buy, sequencing kits to see if we're even gonna get any DNA? That's the first step. And then the same thing down the line, kind of like a domino effect. So it's taught me to be resilient. It's especially taught me to, my grant writing skills are all the way there. But yeah, I think that message in itself, it's been a long road, but you also cannot take no on this path to get to where we are. I think we've all heard more no's than yeses.
And just to point out something that Carter said, or that's implicit in what you said, the barriers, I want to say rarely, I'm going to go ahead and say rarely have to do with you as an individual and how hard you're working. It's a lot of the signifiers and the value that people attach onto things, because what university you go to, who your advisor is, you'd think, it's science, it's objective, yada, yada. No, it's not. And there are a lot of issues that, people are working on now and have done studies about, like, who gets funding, whose questions are important enough. Like, and this is the thing that blows my mind. Like, y'all heard what he does. You can't tell me that's not I'm not gonna swear, it's a great project. It's super exciting, like National Geographic material. Like, I will watch movies about this. Why was it so hard to convince someone? And so my journey, into academia, just because I ended up starting at one elite institution, ended up opening doors, or at least removing barriers that I have seen some of my other Black colleagues face who've come from HBCUs, who've come from other institutions. And that is something that I really want to, rectify and do something about. And, even if it starts with collaborations, but even going to the source and asking questions about why are you not funding the projects that are, that are clearly making a difference and that are different than the things that you've funded 15 million times. But to go to some of my struggles, have you ever tried to cut hair from a Black woman? Like, I have had a lot of participants who would have honestly rather given me a kidney, I think, than when they saw me show up with scissors. No, they didn't. And I started in England, so I went to a lot of African and Afro-Caribbean barbershops, and so you're taking a hair sample, and questions start popping up, like, what kind of juju are you trying to do with this? It's like, okay, I'm Nigerian too. It's not gonna be none of that. I'm not gonna clone anybody. So some of that, that struggle, and I was doing this all on my own. I didn't have a lab that was participating, but it also put me in close proximity with the people who I was studying. And so I got to explain to people, I'm like, hey, isn't our hair cool? This is what I'm trying to answer. And that struggle turned into something that paid off later on. But what I found, the most challenging was the skills that I needed to learn, especially somebody who wasn't coming from necessarily a STEM background. During my PhD, I learned how to code. Actually, in my last 2 years of my PhD, I needed to write an image analysis program in Python, and I had never written a single line of code. However, now it's a published article and a functioning Python package if you want to go on pypy.org. Thank you, thank you. But that is, something that even shocked me. I always, thought I was oh, I'm not really a math person, I'm not really a coding person, but you can learn anything, and especially if you're interested in it, and that's what I wish we gave people more opportunities for. What I found really challenging with a lot of science classes that I didn't find challenging with history was, I was why are we doing this? I don't know who this random Greek is and why we're studying his triangle or his circle, whatever. But when it's oh, I need to figure out how to count pixels so I can tell how curly this hair is, I'm motivated. And I want to give more people opportunities like that to answer questions with tools. Sometimes something can just be a tool that you use to answer your bigger question.
Thank you for those thoughtful answers. So this next question is from the audience as well, and it follows up right with what you all were just talking about. Do you ever have any trouble speaking up about diversity issues with your colleagues? Only say what you're comfortable saying, of course.
I'm always a little too comfortable saying things. I notice in hindsight, apparently somebody's mad at me, whatever. I say this kind of flippantly. I think to some extent, you do benefit from going in with a little bit of a naivete or just even blissful ignorance of you don't know what kind of hatred to expect from people, because a lot of times I'll say something and I'm what I've said is factually true and it makes a lot of sense. Why would anyone have an issue with this? And then you find out the world does not work that way. But somebody needs to do it. Somebody needs to say something about it. And it can be difficult, but finding people outside of the workplace, whatever that is for you, who you can kind of strategize with and have, be in solidarity with you, that makes a huge difference in your resilience, because that's what it is. It's not just one thing that you do once. It's gonna be like every day, every week, every month, you have to keep doing the struggle.
I think it's a good question, thinking especially what we said earlier about representation and how usually it doesn't exist for so many people. So when you are that person, you feel like some pressure, right? Like I need to make sure that like I leave a good, trail behind me so that when the next person comes, they can maybe not to face the same thing I'm going through. So when you do have the moment where it's like, oh, so I'm seeing something that's not okay, that is, they describe that as like the minority tax, right? It's what is my just being myself in this space? How do I calculate all these different potential, risks and benefits? So yeah, I think it's safe to say most people that are in these spaces do have to calculate and ask themselves, like, what is the long-term impact of me speaking up? But I do think, only way to it is through it. You can't circumvent these issues and expect them to not happen again, right? I think it's a tough place to be in, but that usually is the way I end up trying to think about these issues.
I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell, and I'm a snitch, so I'm so serious. So this actually just happened with a paper that I was reviewing with a community of color under study, and there was some like shady stuff, and I acknowledge that I'm a junior person in the field, right? I haven't even started my faculty position yet. And so I'm like, okay, how can I exhaust my resources to find someone who can say what I cannot say to make this change, or to stop this paper, or to get the attention of the editors? But I'm definitely going to say something. I'm going to find a way.
I love it. I love all the responses. So we have time for one more question, and this is from the audience. But I just wanted to say, out of all the amazing things you have already done, all of you, I think your biggest impact is going to be in the future when it comes to the young folks that you inspire. So this question is, what advice would you give a young person that's interested in pursuing a career in genetics or anthropology?
I'll start. I did not have a background in genetics before I came to the NIH. Like I said, I was in physics. There's a building at Morehouse called Dansby. The physics department was in the bottom. We called it the Dansby Dungeon. I was there with 8 other physics majors, so I was totally in a different lane. So my advice would definitely be, do not, easier said than done, but don't think that where you're coming from is going to dictate where you can go. If you have a curiosity, if you have a question, that's extremely valuable. That should be kind of the North Star, I think, for most people, especially younger people that want to do something, have a curiosity. Just keep pulling at that thread and keep making the next right move, and generally I think things will work out for you.
Yeah, I can piggyback off of that. I think that question is a two-sided question. So we want, young scholars to be excited about science and genetics, and we have to meet them halfway. Like, we have to continue to be visible, and we have to continue to stoke that fire while it's early. So I think the statistics are like, African American students are interested in science. Why wouldn't you be? But then, because you come from an under-resourced school, or you didn't have that role model, you get to college, you major that first semester, it's too hard, and then you switch. And so we can't approach students at the undergraduate level. It's clear that we have to do something before that. But that's on our side. But my advice would be to keep going until we meet somewhere in the middle. I like to believe that things are going to change, and I would love to be a part of that change. I've been speaking about a program that I like to start called Lift Every Voice, illuminating the voice of buried populations, but also living people, living communities, descendant communities, but also K through 12, right? Because these are the voices that we need to be listening to determine how to shape their future. So yeah, again, keep going, be resilient, and follow your passion, honestly.
I love that. My advice is going to be a little bit pragmatic, and it has to do with believing in yourself. And my turning point was when I became an actual Pokemon master. This was back when there were only 350 Pokemon, but I had caught all of them and I knew all of their names. And this might sound silly and trivial, but honestly, when I knew all of them, I was like, if I can learn this, I can learn anything. I really just had that in my head. And the way that I went through school, I had a different path than a lot of Americans did, and I learned that coming here and seeing what undergrads have to do. The way people get tested here, I wouldn't be where I am today if I had to pass all of the intro classes that people have to take here. And I say this, not to say that you won't or that it's impossible, but just because you're not good at that class doesn't mean you can't answer questions on a PhD level. And this is the wild thing, because I do some things in certain fields on a post-PhD level, even though maybe I wouldn't pass the intro class. And there's a lot of professors who would not pass their own intro classes, but that's a separate story. So, my advice is find a way to learn something. Just because it's being presented to you in a particular way and you're struggling with it doesn't mean it's the only way that you can learn it. It's like, how do you get from A to B? People will tell you the path that they took, and it's the genuine belief often that if you take the same path, you'll succeed. But sometimes you just gotta go in different directions. So ask as many different people as you can, find different resources, and you'll find that there are different ways of presenting things that are going to make sense to you. So don't be discouraged and try and find that, because it's not you. There's just a million different ways to get from point A to point B, and you just gotta find your path.
Thank you. All of those are wise words. So I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one more. This is just, I think you all can do this in 15 seconds or so. What is next for you? Because we talked about it. I want you to tell everybody out there what's coming up for you in the next 3 months, 6 months, year. Please.
Yeah, sure, I can briefly say it. I'm currently a postdoc at USC, but I will be starting my own lab as assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan. So, thank you. So if anybody wants to be a grad student or a postdoc and is interested in hair, skin, and human variation, you know where to find me.
Yeah, I am a postdoc at Penn State University, but I am on the job market now. So I don't know where I'll end up in a few months. But you can always follow me on my socials to find out.
And I am going to be going to medical school to be a doctor. Where yet? We still don't know. We'll see where the cards are going to fall, but that'll be happening in the summer or early fall. So.
Awesome. Let's give it up one more time for our panelists. And we'll invite Mr. Leslie Walker to come back to the stage for closing remarks.
So my name is Leslie Walker. I'm a program producer here at the museum, and I had the wonderful opportunity of working with these wonderful individuals to bring this presentation to you all today in partnership with our colleagues at NHGRI. And I just wanted to thank you so much for coming out today and enjoying the weather and enjoying this wonderful conversation. I hope you all return home very safely. Thank you so much, and happy Black History Month.